It is my distinct pleasure to moderate this session this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening with Dr. Vint Cerf. I am really super excited to present him and moderate the session and also introduce some of your questions. So those of you that have questions during our presentation, please go ahead and submit those. So without further ado, I'd like to give the introduction to Dr. Vint Cerf. He's the Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google, and he contributes to global policy and business development and the continued spread of the internet. But we all know him as one of the fathers of the internet. Yes, he is the co-designer of the TCP/IP protocols and the architecture of the internet. He has served in executive positions in many societies, including the Internet Society, Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, American Registry for Internet Numbers. And he's also sat on very prestigious boards around the world, including the U.S. National Science Board as a visiting science at the Jet Propulsion Lab. He's also a member of the Royal Academy and Swedish Academy of Engineering. He's a fellow of numerous organizations, including IEEE, but he's an eminent member of HKN and has been a longtime supporter of HKN and our students. So he is also on the faculty at Stanford University. And finally, he's got numerous accolades. He's a member of the National Academies of Engineering and Science, and he has been awarded the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering, the Charles Stark Draper Award, the Turing Award, and has 29 honorary degrees. I think we need to up that to make it an even number, Dr. Cerf. So we'll work on that one. But other than that, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Cerf.
Morning, good afternoon, good evening, Karen. I guess good day, we'll have to do it. Either that or we're going to come up with another term. Since we've all been video conferencing for the last 2.5 years, and it involves people in all 24-hour time zones. I guess new language is going to be needed. But thanks so much for having me on the show. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, I wanted to start out, the first thing everybody's going to want to know is your own perspective on your own career, what IEEE and Eta Kappa Nu have meant to you. So I'll let you, tell your own story rather than asking about it.
Okay, well, thanks so much for that invitation, Karen. A couple of things. First of all, being a member of IEEE is important to me, and of course, Eta Kappa Nu is even icing on the cake. What's important is that it gives an indication of your professional status. You don't get into these things just because you signed up. You have to have other people who are essentially recommending you for elevated positions like fellow. And so having that in your resume is simply an indication of professionalism. I joined other organizations for similar reasons, like the Association for Computing Machinery. So that's the first point, is simply showing professional indications. I will say, though, based on my experience over the past 50 years or so, that I've learned a few lessons. I'd like to share them with you. The first one is that if you're going to try to do something big, lesson number one says get help. Preferably from people who are smarter than you are. And of course, in my case, that wasn't a very high bar. But I couldn't tell you, I could not overemphasize how important it is to recognize that you can't do everything and you don't know everything. And so if you really want to do something big and serious, get help is a really good piece of advice. Then the second thing I've learned over my career is that patience and persistence really count, and that it takes time for some of these things to happen. The internet, for example, when Bob Kahn and I started doing the original design work in 1973, based on earlier work that we'd done with others in 1969, it took us 10 years to get from the basic architecture to ready to turn it on operationally. So a 10-year period from 73 to 83. And it took time to make mistakes and iterate, to correct the design and everything else. So patience and persistence, very important. That should be a t-shirt. The other thing I've learned, especially at Google, where everybody is younger than I am, roughly speaking, these folks come running up and they say, why don't we do X for some value of X? And they all think about this. And I say, we tried X 25 years ago and it didn't work. But then I have to remind myself, okay, there's a reason it didn't work, and it could be that reason is not valid anymore. For example, memory was too expensive, now it's cheap. The computer wasn't fast enough, now it's faster. The physical size was too big, it weighs too much, or it takes too much space, now it doesn't. So there are a lot of things that I have had to rethink as a result of the passage of time. And so don't get stuck in we tried it before and it didn't work without asking yourself, why not? And does it work now, or could it work now? Here's another thought that might be important to you. You might know that in the past 100 years, on average, lifetimes have doubled. People used to die when they were 35 or 40. Now they live into their 80s, and kids born today might very well live to be 100, which means they'll live to see the 22nd century. It makes me wish I was 8 years old right now, but because I'm curious about that. But the point is, suppose you live to be 100. Imagine now what that means. Well, you go to school, go to high school, you go to college, maybe you even go to an honorary degree. So suppose you spent the first 20 to 25 years of your life studying something, in preparation for a career. I want you to think for just a second now what the implications of living to 100 are, because that might mean a career that lasts 60 or 70 years. Now, I can tell you, just to give you a concrete example of the implications of that, I want you to think back to 2007, which is only 15 years ago, when Steve Jobs announced the iPhone. That was a hypergolic event because it joined the internet and mobile telephony together in the smartphone. It made the internet more accessible and made the smartphone more useful because of all the content on the internet and the applications that were available. Now, imagine over a career of 70 years, how many of those events might actually happen. Mm-hmm. And think of the changes that it introduced. I mean, we are now extremely dependent on mobile phones or smartphones, millions of applications. Of course, I worry about this because, if they don't work, there are cascade failures. Like I couldn't get logged in, so I couldn't get the email, and I couldn't conclude the deal, and my company went bankrupt. So there are a lot of reasons to be concerned about dependence on these technologies. But you can't ignore the fact that more of them will come. And that means that you're going to have to be prepared to learn new things. And that means this term lifelong learning, which has been around forever, used to mean getting up at 5 in the morning to watch calculus classes on television. Today it means going to YouTube and saying, how do I do X for some value of X? In the long run, we have to learn how to learn. We have to learn to want to learn. Mm-hmm. In order to stay productive and useful. So 100-year lifetime implies learning all the time, or certainly learning repeatedly. Just to give you another example of it takes a long time for stuff to happen, the interplanetary internet work started in 1998, and we are just at the point now where we can say we're at a cusp where we can start implementing it seriously. Final point. A lot of young people come to me, students and others, and say, can you help me plan my career? And, after I get done laughing, I apologize for laughing. And then I say,
sorry, I laughed.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. And I tell them, look, nobody can plan their career. Talk to anyone who's successful, and they'll tell you they never would have predicted they ended up where they are. It's kind of like standing when you're young. Imagine standing in front of a forest. And you're going to try to find your way through the forest. And it's not obvious exactly how to do that. So you start out and you work your way in and you ricochet off a few trees. Now, halfway through, if you turn around and look back, you can see how you got there. Mm-hmm. But you never would have predicted that was how you were going to get there. Mm-hmm. So my advice is don't try to plan your career, but learn how to be sensitive to and aware of opportunities that show up. Sometimes they show up in a guise that doesn't look like opportunity, like you got fired or your company failed or your project didn't work. All the, big disappointments. And yet sometimes what they do is open up an opportunity that you otherwise would not have noticed. Mm-hmm. So observing opportunity and learning to detect it is really important. And finally, when you're young, it's okay to try risky stuff. I mean, don't jump out of the 10th floor window to prove gravity works. That's stupid. But, you know, when you're young and you try something and it might not work, it's okay because you got many years to recover. Now, when you get old like me, that's a different story. Maybe probably a little less risky. But the long point here is that when you're young, it's okay to take some risk. So, Karen, those are just a few of the life lessons that I am happy to share with the folks who are participating in this call, and I'll be happy to try to answer your and their questions.
Terrific. Thank you so much for that. You know, you hit on so many different things. And I think the one thing that I want to start with is this, you know, the career path. Students think so much that it's a linear trajectory, and they try to, and they all want to say that we're all the same. And I think that's one of the things that we're trying to really promote is that engineering, it's your creativity, your imagination, your perspectives, the things you've experienced that make you unique and give you that different perspective to come up with new innovations. So, you know, in your own career, Dr. Cerf, for instance, did you even, when you were thinking about the internet, did you even think of the scale that it would be at today?
Yes. At this time, I can say yes. And the reason is that although we didn't get it right, I mean, we are actually were off. But when Bob and I were doing the original work, we tried to figure out, okay, so how many termination points should we plan for? And we ended up planning for 4.3 billion terminations, a 32-bit address space. Well, we knew that this was being designed as the backbone for the Defense Department command and control. I mean, that was the intent anyway. And so we knew it had to work all around the world. And we knew it had to work with others because our allies would have to interact with us. Mm-hmm. So we planned. Now, I also have to say, though, when we first did the design, we allowed for, let's see, we said, how many countries are there? And we didn't know, and there wasn't any Google to ask. So we guessed at 256, or no, 128. I think we guessed 128 or something. It actually turned out that there were 193 or now, and there were probably 170 back then. So we allocated 8 bits of address space for network. And then how many hosts would be in each network? And I know, I'm sorry, it was 128 countries and then 2 networks per country, so there'd be some competition. So that's 256. Then we allocated 24 bits for host ID, and that's 2 to the 24th, which is a lot. You know, that's on the order of 16 million hosts per network. We thought that'd be enough for the experiment. Of course, we didn't know if this was going to work. Well, we ran out around 2011 of that IP version 4 32-bit address space. But in 1992, we all recognized we're going to need more. So we developed IP version 6. Mm-hmm. If you wonder what happened to IP version 5, it was an experiment with streaming video and audio that didn't scale. So we abandoned that. IPv6 has a 128-bit address space. That's 3.4 times 10 to the 38th addresses, mm-hmm. is a number only the Congress can appreciate. And so that's where we are. We've been pushing to get IPv6 implemented everywhere, and frankly, it's been a slow slog. We're back to patience and persistence again, about 30% penetration on average. Mm-hmm. So we did plan for scale, and that much we knew. Also, the ARPANET project, which is the predecessor to the internet, taught us about a lot of applications, one of which, of course, was electronic mail, which gets invented in 1971, 2 years after the ARPANET gets turned on. And then we were working on packet voice and packet speech because we knew command and control would require that, you know, voice, video, and data. And although we couldn't do very much because the data rates were very low, we also anticipated that over time that we would increase data rates with new technology. We were very careful to layer the architecture, which we learned from the ARPANET project. And the Internet Protocol layer in particular doesn't know how it's being carried. Mm-hmm. And that means that you can sweep in new technology underneath the Internet Protocol layer to carry the packets, and they don't care. Like a postcard doesn't have any idea how it was carried. The other trick was that the postcard doesn't know what you wrote on it, and an Internet packet doesn't know what's in the payload. It's just bits. It gets interpreted at the edge of the net where the computers are, which means if you invent a new application, that needs a reinterpretation of the bits in the payload, the network doesn't care. It doesn't know. You don't have to change the net. You just reinterpret the bits. So it could be email, it could be a piece of an image or part of a video stream or some other application. The network just doesn't care. And that has given enormous flexibility to people inventing new applications, because with the tens of thousands of networks on the internet, if everybody had to change the network so you could add a new application, that would be really hard.
Yes.
But we don't have to do that.
All right. But I got to ask the other question. So, we were joking before we got on how long it took us to log in and all the cycles we had to go through with the passwords and stuff. Did you think about the way it would be used and how much security you were going to need?
Well, yes and no. First of all, at the time that we were doing the design, 1973, there was no packet crypto available.
Mm-hmm.
All we had were link encryptors from the NSA, and we even used some of those experimentally. Then we started using the DES protocol, which is or crypto scheme, which it does support packet crypto. But I knew, since we were building this for the Defense Department, it clearly is going to have all kinds of security built into it. But at the time that we were doing the design, the only available crypto was classified. And so, but we had graduate students doing all this other stuff, and they didn't have clearances. So I left that for later, deliberately, in the belief that we could retrofit an awful lot of the crypto capability and other security measures into the system, which we have done. That doesn't mean that we're done. There's a huge amount of work to be done to get rid of the bugs that people are exploiting, the vulnerabilities at the edges of the net, in the hosts especially, but even in the network protocols like the Border Gateway Protocol, which links all the nets together. There could be more work to minimize the potential errors that show up or deliberate misinformation that shows up. So there is work to be done there. But the biggest question in my mind at the time was, if we enforce a bunch of security measures on graduate students, is that going to work? And my conclusion was that asking graduate students to observe the discipline of crypto key management and everything else was probably a non-starter. So we didn't do that. Today, of course, now that this is heavily depended upon and it's commercialized as well as being used by the military, there's no doubt in my mind that we need substantial increases in attention to security measures. We use two-factor authentication using small chips that go into the USB port. I'll try to show you one here. Here is a tiny little, whoops, there we go, a little USB crypto generator. And what happens when I log in at Google is that it asks me for my cryptographic password, and I tickle the little USB gadget, and it generates a cryptographic exchange. So that's my second factor. Some people are using their mobile phones for that, but that's actually not the most secure way to do it, unless the phone has crypto capability like this little USB gadget does.
Yeah, I was going to ask then, so you had the internet, you had the security. What about the Internet of Things? Now you've got sensors on every machine in manufacturing, on cameras. How did that affect you? What did you think about that?
Well, actually, I think a lot about that. And my colleagues at Google probably have small bruises where I beat them over the head. My big worry about IoT is that a lot of these devices are intended to be consumer products at relatively low cost. So, a Philips Hue light bulb, for example, or a webcam, or maybe a furnace AC controller or something like that. And there are parties who are making these things who would like to keep their costs down. And so they ask, okay, so what software should I put in here? And they say, well, how about open source? It's cheap. It doesn't cost anything. So they go grab an open source operating system and throw it in, and they may take some other library stuff. And the problem with open source, which I love, I think it's enabling. It allows people to do things that they don't have time to do themselves, like build a whole new operating system. But what it potentially does is ingest a bunch of vulnerability into the system. So we have work to do to make the IoT devices more secure, And there are several things that we might want to, if we can't make it the law, we can at least make a recommendation that you follow certain principles.
Mhm.
So as an example, one thing you want is that the device has cryptographic capability in it so that it can identify itself to someplace else. Maybe it's the control system, so that the control system can recognize that this box was configured into the system with a certain cryptographic signature. And the other way around, we want to tell the IoT device, your controller is over there, it has this public key, and you should demand of it proof that it has the private key associated with the public key before you either reveal any information or accept any commands.
Mhm.
You also want to take care of the IoT device's software when you discover there's a bug in it. You would insist that the manufacturer has the ability to update the software. Then you'd want to make sure that the device knows where the software should come from. Is it digitally signed?
Mhm.
Has it survived intact without being modified by somebody in between the source and the destination? You'd use crypto signatures and hashes for that too. So you want these devices to be designed with a defensive model in mind. You might even want to have some additional box, some middleware box, which is between all the IoT devices at home or at work or in a manufacturing plant and the rest of the internet. And this middle box would be filtering traffic, looking for possible attacks, looking for malware and other kinds of things, so that the devices in the IoT space don't have to be as sophisticated as they would have to be if they were defending themselves. So they're all kind of, it's just a partial list of the various things that IoT raises in my mind, including, by the way, having access to source code in the event that the manufacturer decides to sunset support
Yes.
for the device, because you want a third party, if not you, you want a third party to be able to pick up the maintenance requirement, because some of these devices could last for decades. I mean, if
Right.
it's an air conditioning system or major security system or something like that, it could be in use for 10, 20, 30 years.
That's a great point, because a lot of third world countries, they get older technology and they really use it for their business, for their livelihoods, and then the software
And all of a sudden, it
and
doesn't work.
they're left with nothing. That's a great point. The other thing I wanted to jump in on before it falls out of my brain is, you mentioned that engineers have to design more defensively, and that is a total paradigm shift in education, because we're taught to go to the spec and make sure it compiles, and we don't look outside. And I think that's today's engineers have to have now a whole new tool set behind them to know how to do that. Can you comment on that?
This is such a good point. I'm glad you made it, because I admit to you that at the time we were doing the ARPANET and the early internet, first of all, we all knew each other. It was a small cadre of people. We're talking about a few hundred, like 250 people. And it never occurred to any of us that somebody would try to break the system. We were trying to get it to work, let alone, tear it down or tear it apart. We did some robustness tests. I mean, we weren't, entirely ignorant, but we didn't do, red team kinds of tests to see how we could penetrate the system. Now, I knew eventually we'd have to do that, because with the Defense Department's reliance on that for command and control, it obviously had to be very well defended. But at the early stages, we didn't think about that. Today, of course, your point is exactly right. We do have to think about that, and we should think up front about how are we going to defend ourselves from malicious attacks, whether it's ransomware or denial of service attacks or a surreptitious attempt to take over control of the device. All of those things are quite real. And I'm sorry to say that the reason that we have those problems is that we don't know how to write software that doesn't have bugs. We've been programming for 80 years, not me personally, but in the history of computing, and we haven't figured out how to avoid bugs. And other people who are just as smart figure out how to exploit the bugs in order to take over control, or reveal information that they shouldn't have, your credentials or bank accounts and other kinds of things. So we really have to pay attention to exactly the problem of bugs and vulnerabilities and software update to fix bugs, because they are hazardous.
Mhm.
And I think we need for people to I think gain a certain digital literacy to be aware of the potential hazards. I'm not quite serious about this, but you know, when you want to drive a car, we make you take tests, we give you classes, we make you renew on a regular basis to show you still remember how to drive the car and how to follow the rules.
Mhm.
I wonder if we shouldn't have an internet driver's license
Mhm.
where you get classes showing you how vulnerable you could be if you weren't paying attention. So if some random email shows up saying, "Oh, you should click on this. It's a great video. Don't do it."
Mhm.
Or if it comes from some
The common sense things that trip people, the phishing scams. Yes, and I think that across educational institutions, it's got to be a whole different mind shift and paradigm of how we teach this.
well,
So we have
yeah,
lots
I mean,
of,
think about you teach kids to look both ways before they cross the road. And by the way, it's really important to look both ways because you might be in the UK, in which case you're on the
oh, absolutely. But even with the driver's license, I'm saying you haven't. I live in Boston, so I don't know if you've seen the drivers here. But even with licenses, in the training, we should revoke some of those licenses and make them go back for retraining. But I did want to talk about you. You talked about lifelong learning. I think what I'd like to hear is, what about AI now? AI has become so prevalent. People are jumping into it. And that's another one that kind of worries me because they're jumping into it not knowing the full
exactly what.
information.
Yeah,
But how do you think AI is going to affect, and what's your opinions on the
well,
state of AI?
well, the way you describe that makes me think of chemistry sets in the 1950s. My best friend and I made nitroglycerin. Now, let me tell you, that was a stupid thing to do. But the chemistry sets of that era had stuff in them that you could make some pretty serious stuff with. It had potassium permanganate, and if you mix that with glycerin, it's hypergolic and it lights on. It blows up, or at least lights on fire. So I am worried about this whole question of machine learning, which is the form of AI that we're focused on right now. It's been the most successful, but it's brittle.
Mhm.
It's often really wonderfully functional in a narrow sense.
Mhm.
But if you confront it with something that it wasn't trained for, it may do something silly like image recognition. You show it a cat, and then you twiddle a few little bits, and it says it's a fire engine.
Mhm.
And you're sitting here saying, how could it possibly think it's a fire engine? And the answer is the machine learning system doesn't recognize things the same way we do. It's a peculiar pastiche of statistical analysis. And
And the ones that worry me about that are the ones like that are making decisions on people's careers, right? Because
well,
nobody questions it.
or a loan, or some other or getting into college or getting a job. So we really need to be conscious of how brittle those systems can be. And whenever I listen to people hopping up and down about machine learning and demonstrating some pretty amazing stuff. I mean, Google has a company called DeepMind, which we work closely with, and their Alpha Zero system, the original AlphaGo, if you remember,
Yes.
successfully was playing Go games, and everybody thought that was not possible. But we have to be very thoughtful about the risk factor and be prepared to detect that machine learning has made a mistake.
Yes. Yes. And accept it, not that say, the computer says this is the definitive answer.
That's
And
exactly
our
right.
public doesn't know that. That's, so when you talked about AI literacy, it's not just for the STEM, students of studying STEM. It's our job also to help disseminate that into K through 12 and the general public, which is probably even a more challenging problem these days.
Well, I think you make a really, really good point. We'll call it digital literacy, we'll call it critical thinking. Everyone should learn to do that. We should be asking questions like, where did this information come from? Is there corroborating evidence for assertions that are being made? Um, is somebody trying to persuade me of something that I don't want to do or shouldn't do? We should be asking those questions. By the way, that works not just online, but it works with newspapers, magazines, movies, your friends. All these other sources of information deserve the same kind of critical analysis in order to avoid taking on board bad information.
That's right. That's right. So right now we've got questions coming in from our audience. So let's go ahead and take one of the questions. So this one comes from Russ Meyer. How can young professionals appropriately curate the mass amount of learning material on the internet? What is your philosophy for what is real and what may not be such a good source of information when seeking technical content?
Well, there isn't any generic answer to this, but what I would say is that provenance turns out to be really important. And so when you think about it, where did this information come from? Does it have any indicia of quality? Is it from a magazine that's peer reviewed, for example, or does it have a reputation for accuracy like the New York Times? So you would ask, where did it come from first? The second thing I think I would ask is, or suggest, is that you might inquire of your friends who might have expertise in some particular area, what they would recommend. Or perhaps you might send a reference and say, do you know this article, and should I be paying attention to it? So asking people whose opinions you have come to value is also a thing that you can do. By the way, we've been doing this for years. This is not just an internet thing or a World Wide Web thing. We didn't ever read all the magazines published and all the books published and watch all the movies and all the TV shows. We filtered the information by asking our friends for their advice, or maybe looking at the Times bestseller list. We sought references to help us filter information that we would wanted to take advantage of.
Mm-hmm.
So we can apply those techniques to the online world as well.
Okay. Do we have another question? I think we have one more question. This one comes from Michael Benson. It's about IPv6. Seems to be designed to be nearly future-proof. Can you think of any situations that may require a new version of the protocol?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, we've been living with this problem for 20 years now. When we started working, this group at the Jet Propulsion Lab, and now all of NASA labs, and also ESA and JAXA and CARI in Korea, all of the space agencies have been working on the interplanetary internet. But it turns out that we started this work in 1998. And this was just after the Pathfinder landed on Mars in 1997. We're all excited because for 20 years, nothing worked after the Viking landers in 76. So we're saying, what should we do that we will be needed 25 years later? So this is in 1998. And so we said, well, we should figure out how to build an interplanetary backbone network so we can support manned and robotic space exploration. And so I thought, well, TCP/IP works okay on Earth, so it ought to work on Mars. And then we started to do the math, and we discovered that the speed of light was too slow, thanks to Dr. Einstein. It takes 3.5 minutes for a radio signal to go from Earth to Mars when we're closest together. And when we're farthest apart, which is on the order of 235 million miles, it takes 20 minutes one way at the speed of light, and of course, double that to come back. TCP has a flow control scheme, which is very simple. If you run out of room, you send an email, or not an email, you send a packet to the other guy saying, stop, I've run out of room. Now, if it only takes a few tens of or hundreds of milliseconds for that message to get there, usually your correspondent will stop sending and you can buffer a little bit of that. But what if it takes 20 minutes to get the message to the other side? They've been pumping it at actually full speed after you sent them a note saying, I'm out of room. So, you can't put the packets anywhere and they fall on the floor or the dog eats them or something. So flow control doesn't work very well with a 40-minute round trip time. And there's also another problem. The planets are rotating and we don't know how to stop that. If you're talking to something on the surface and the planet rotates, you can't talk to it until it comes back around. Same problem with the satellites. So we have a variably delayed and disrupted environment. And so we had to develop a suite of protocols that were capable of dealing with that parametric space. And we call it the bundle protocol suite. It's different from the TCP/IP suite. It's basically bundle protocol and the internet protocol are the similar layer, but they have very different characteristics. For example, in the bundle system, we actually store information in the network. We don't do that with internet. If there's no place to go in the next hop, we throw it away because we know it could be retransmitted end to end with fairly brief delay. But suppose you're trying to send data to Jupiter and you've gotten it up to the Mars relay, the last thing you want is for the Mars relay to say, can't talk to Jupiter right now, and throw it away.
Yep. Yep.
So instead it holds onto it in the network, which is a very different thing from the internet design. And there are a number of other things. Network management turns out to be very different in this high delay environment. In the internet, you send a ping packet and you expect to get a response back in half a second or less. But what if you're trying to ping something out near Pluto? It's going to be many hours before you get a ping back, and you don't know how many hops it had to go through, and you don't know if it got lost on the way. So you have to do network management in a very different mindset than this interactive stuff. It is anything but. Communications is going to be like that. It's not going to be like this kind of interaction that we're doing right now. It'll be more like sending video in email as an attachment. So we had to develop a whole new suite of protocols. So the answer about, is there something after IPv6? The answer is yes. In the case of interplanetary, we need a different protocol suite.
Okay, so I have to elaborate on that because I asked my 9-year-old son Benjamin this morning when I told him I was meeting you, and he said, well, space exploration, there's been more space exploration than there has ocean exploration here on Earth. So he said, I had a question for Dr. Cerf is, well, will it work underwater?
So the answer is yes. And in fact, we have tested, well, of course, there's subsea cables, and there's bazillions of them now. And of course, they are transmitting data at 400 gigabits a second, which is unbelievable. It's like 10 million times faster than the original design, which was 50 kilobits a second. But we have tested the delay interruption tolerant protocols using sonar water, literally. And of course, the distances are a function of wavelength and frequency and so on. But we've actually tested the protocols under those conditions. So the answer is yes, it does work underwater.
So I will let him know that. He's super excited to know that and share that with his 4th grade class. So thank you for that one. I think we have one more question from our audience. This one comes from Rafael Ortega. It says, what do you think would be the impact of quantum computing on the internet in the next few years?
So let's separate this into two pieces. One is quantum networking and the other is quantum computing. And let me separate the quantum networking into two parts. One of them is quantum key distribution, and the other one is real quantum distribution of entangled particles in a network. So on the computing side, Google and others have been investing heavily in quantum computing. One of the things that is truly challenging about it is that if you're going to design and build a quantum processor, you have to put up with the fact that the quantum entanglement doesn't last very long. It tends to dissipate. And you have to maintain that entangled state in order to continue the computation. So the way that you get around that is to build a large number of physical qubits to make one logical qubit. And it could be as many as 1,000 physical qubits to make one long-lasting, error-correcting logical qubit. So that's a big challenge, just to deal with the density and scale that you have to build these quantum computers at. In terms of their utility, I'm quite excited about it. There are a small number of known algorithms that we think would be useful. One of them would be useful for cracking some of the cryptographic codes that depend on trying to factor the products of very large primes. That factorization is hard if you do it with conventional means, but when you have a quantum computer and you use Shor's algorithm, in theory, you could break it in a reasonable amount of time, which is why, by the way, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology are developing post-quantum cryptographic codes. They narrowed it down to 3, as I understand it, and there'll be a selection made probably either this year or next year. So quantum computing is quite real, but it is not yet, I would say, useful in solving practical problems. If we wanted to build a large quantum computer with a large number of logical qubits, which might mean an even larger number of physical qubits, you might decide that you can't build a single machine with literally millions of qubits in it. So what do? Well, you might build a number of smaller machines and then connect them in a network.
Mhm.
But the connecting network has to preserve the entangled state of photons moving from one machine to another, entangling the two machines with each other. And so the hard part here is to transport entangled photons in such a way that they don't lose their state and they arrive and effectively entangle the other computer with the first one. And now you can imagine replicating that to get more and more quantum computing capability. So that's something still TBD. Quantum relay is a big challenge. And the last point with regard to quantum is quantum key distribution. This has less to do with computation than it does basically with the fact that if you interfere with let's say, an over-the-air laser or an in-the-fiber laser pulse, if you interfere with a photon that was entangled with something, it will lose its entangled state, which loses its utility in quantum computing. So figuring out how to send, let's say you generate two entangled photons and you send one of them distant through the quantum network and the other you keep locally. By the time the other one gets to the other computer through this quantum network, it's now entangled both of them. And we need to find ways of relaying the photons so that they don't lose their state. Because if they lose their state, then it's not entangled anymore, and then you don't get the speed up effect that you're looking for. So I'm actually quite excited about all this, but I'm not holding my breath. Because this one feels like the patience and persistence observation
Get there.
that I made earlier, that this is going to take a while.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so I think we have one more question from the audience. This one is saying, this one's coming from a mechatronic engineering bachelor students. May I know how far AI will go? Like, it is safe for us to assume that AI is not going to harm us in the future, but rather assist us in our work forever. Interested in becoming an AI engineer. So this is from one of our students. And I think we're talking more about bias and again, the general public not understanding the implications of just agreeing with the AI. So what comments do you have for that, Dr. Cerf?
Well, first, Stacy, let me encourage you. I'm delighted to know that you want to become an AI engineer. Second, the term artificial intelligence is a little misleading. We've been using that term since the 1960s, and so far we've managed to make a lot of artificial idiots, as far as I can tell. That's not entirely fair. The multi-layer neural networks have done some very amazing things in terms of diagnosis and the like, game playing, and even some strategic behaviors. This is all based on Bayesian logic and the ingestion of a substantial amount of probabilistic and statistical data. The problem is that these systems are not perfect by any means. And the consequence is that if they don't function as intended, there is potential harm, especially if we're talking about autonomous weapon systems, for example. But even a self-driving car, if it makes a mistake, could have fatal consequences. So the first thing we should remember is that these may not work properly, and therefore we should be building and surrounding them with other mechanisms for constraining behavior so that it can't get out sufficiently out of hand that it's hazardous. As much as I am a fan of Isaac Asimov and the Foundation series and the 3 laws of robotics, I don't believe that we have reached the point yet where we can assure ourselves that those 3 laws are actually implementable in a way that preserves safety. So we may need to build in other mechanisms for constraining the behavioral space of an AI-based system. Sometimes you might do that by physical, you imagine that you don't allow the wing or the aileron or something to go further than a certain distance. So even if the AI says it should go over here and the plane would flip over, put physical restrictions on the system so that it can't do that.
Right, which we could probably get maybe by coupling with digital twins?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Digital twins could be our friend here. And so we'd want to be able to not only design these kinds of safety features in, but we need to test them, obviously, in as many different context as we can. So I'm actually a big fan of the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning as an augmentation tool. I think about I'm language disabled, for example. I, like many Americans, I speak English or some brand of it anyway. Ich spreche wenig Deutsch. Jag говорю медленно и плохо по-русски. Je ne parle pas français. Yo hablo no español. And so for many of those, I don't speak the language and I need help. And thank goodness, artificial intelligence and machine learning have done a pretty good job of translation. At Google, we have Google Translate, which has saved my butt several times when trying to communicate with people who don't happen to have English as their native tongue or a convenient one. So that's really helpful. Augmented reality is another example where AI and machine learning can be very, very helpful. So I see this as a potential for assistance to augment our capabilities, which is what Douglas Engelbart was talking about in the 1950s, along with J.C.R. Licklider, the first director of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency Information Processing Techniques Office. Believed, along with Engelbart, that non-numerical computing could augment our ability to think. So I'm very excited about that, and I still believe in it, but I also think that we also have these systems that will work incorrectly, will not work as planned, and we need to prepare for that.
I always have a saying that, to me, when somebody asks my definition of AI, I said it's to help us explore, explain, and expand our knowledge. And that way, more than everybody thinks we're replacing humans, and it's not about that. So we do have another question, if you'd like to post that question.
Sure.
This one is, how can AI be implemented in medicine to avoid the loss of life, like cancer?
So this is a really good question, and it is being used today, often for diagnosis. So we can show these machine learning systems cells that are known to be diseased in one way or another, and cells that are healthy. And we train these systems to recognize the difference between the two. And then we take slides or pictures of someone's cellular biopsy samples and try to recognize whether there is a medical problem. One thing that we were quite successful at was getting ophthalmologists to detect retinal problems with what is it called, diabetic retinopathy. And we had about 80 different ophthalmologists looking at imagery of the retina and judging whether or not this retinopathy existed there or not. And then we trained the machine learning algorithm based on what these 80 different guys reported for the imagery that they were shown. And it turned out that the combined system in the machine learning mechanism, the multi-layer net, did a better job than any one of those ophthalmologists in diagnosing diabetic retinopathy. And you can imagine for other kinds of conditions, cancer cells included, we might be able to detect, or at the very least alert and say, you should look more carefully at this. This looks like it could be cancerous. Now, in terms of solving cancer, this is obviously a hard problem. We've been at it for many, many years without a lot of success, but we're starting to learn more and more about what it is that causes cells to continue to replicate instead of replicating a finite number of times and then essentially committing suicide, which is what cell apoptosis is all about. So they typically will reproduce 50 times. And at that point, replication of the DNA, which is required for cell replication, starts to fail. And at that point, most cells have been programmed to essentially stop living. I mean, they commit suicide. But some of them don't. And they go two different ways. Some of them just stop reproducing and just start producing sort of toxic materials, sort of like grumpy old men. And in fact, I wrote an article in the Communications of ACM called Grumpy Old Cells that just sit around. They're called senescent cells, and they just sit around, they don't reproduce, and they just pump out toxins. If we could identify those somehow, then, and zap them, that would make us healthier. But the other possibility is that a cell decides that it is not going to stop reproducing. Normally, there are telomeres at the edges of the DNA, and the telomere gets shorter by one length in both sides during the reproductive process. And so when it gets to a small enough number of telomeres, the cell recognizes that and says, I can't successfully replicate this DNA. I'm going to push this button and disappear.
Mm-hmm.
But some cells figured out to tell themselves to extend the telomeres
Mm-hmm.
and not push the button. So we need to find those cells, if we can, by something that might be on the surface of the cell, to send T cells to basically swallow them up and get rid of them.
Wow. So, I want to capitalize on two things you said here. One, you talked about collecting data from 80 experts. That ground truth, I'm hoping in the future that we don't have to expend that manual labor to get all that ground truth. But that is essential for training. And I think a lot of folks underestimate the importance of collecting ground truths, data like that. And then the second thing I wanted to just, as we're closing up here, you've demonstrated, you talked about medicine, space exploration, you've talked about more than the internet. And that shows the diversity and breadth that you've accumulated over your time. And that's something I hope our audience takes away is you're not just a digital simulator expert or, a semiconductor expert. As you go along, you learn biomed, but you might not be a medical doctor, right? You'll learn different things, signal processing, even though you might just be programming or an AI person. So can you summarize like how all these diverse perspectives come together and really build a capable, engineer?
Well, first of all, my original training was in mathematics, but I got infected with computing very early on while I was an undergraduate. And then when I got to graduate school at UCLA, I got infected with networking, and that's a permanent condition. But here's the deal. It's all software. When you get right down to it, nothing happens unless there's software. And so software is this endless frontier. It's limited only by your imagination and ability to write code. Mm-hmm. So the consequence of that is that computing and computer networking have just an endless array of possibilities. And so people keep getting drawn in, to my orbit anyway, with new ideas for how to write software to animate these systems and make them do useful work. And so I've been forced to learn a great deal. And of course, the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know, which is a classic problem. After a while, you realize you know about this much and the rest of the universe is this big. It's sort of like the problem we have in astrophysics right now. We know about 5% of the universe, which is matter and antimatter, and then we don't know what dark energy and dark matter are. We just gave them labels, but they basically we say, I haven't got a clue.
So I want to thank you so much for joining with us here today, Dr. Cerf. Do you have any closing comments or advice for our young folks watching this?
Well, first of all, reminder, when you're young, it's okay to take career risks and things like that because you'll be able to recover from it. And second, don't stop learning because you're going to need that. And so you need to keep your curiosity bump going all the time. You know how they say that growing old is inevitable, but growing up is optional.
We can stay with that. So with that, I'd like to thank Dr. Cerf for joining us here today. And I hope you've all enjoyed this episode of our X Factor Talk. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, Dr. Cerf. See you soon.
You're most welcome, Karen. It's a real pleasure.
Bye, everybody.
Well, Gus, thanks so much. Wasn't that wonderful? And thank you, Dr. Cerf. We really appreciate your being so generous with your time and actually for all of your great comments about Eta Kappa Nu and being involved. And if you want to learn more about Eta Kappa Nu and you want to learn more about IEEE, please be in touch with us. You can hit us up on our website, www.hkn.org, info@hkn.org. So we have lots coming up for you today in the rest of the HKN Experience. Immediately following this session, we're going right into our career fair. The career fair is a great opportunity to meet with several of our our sponsors and companies and talk to them about opportunities they have open, careers that you're interested in, and really start to have some conversations. We've got followed by several terrific sessions on decoding jobs in artificial intelligence, from Textron Bell Systems, and they've got some great things, and electrification for a more sustainable world by ANSYS. So lots coming up today. And tomorrow we'll have another great group of panels and great group of sessions from our IEEE young professionals about navigating your career, and the great debate with several of our subject matter experts and our IEEE technical societies, and our power hour discussions, which are going to be these great technical discussions within their expo booths, really designed to get some critical thinking happening and get a real great exchange of ideas. So we really hope that you'll join us, participate, bring all your questions, learn a lot of new things, and get engaged and involved through the HKN experience. I think, Jim Conrad, our president, you're going to take us out and send us off to the next session now.
Sure thing. Thank you again for being a participant. Remember, we have things going on all day today, as well as tomorrow. Make sure that you look at everything that we have to offer, specifically the opportunity to talk with companies, hiring companies as well. And we look forward to seeing you in all of our sessions today and tomorrow. Thank you very much.